The stage was set. Bright lights, a packed audience, and a host who had only one goal: to tear JD Vance apart. The vice president sat calmly in his chair, but he could already feel the hostility in the air. This wasn't an interview. It was an ambush. The host, a well-known liberal commentator, leaned forward with a smirk. His voice was smooth, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Mr. Vice President, let's get right to it. The Trump administration is tearing this country apart. You support extreme conservative values, banning abortion, forcing your religious beliefs on others, pushing anti-LGBTQ policies. So tell me, are you here to defend your bigotry?" The audience erupted in applause. Some laughed, others jeered. It was clear whose side they were on. JD Vance didn't react. He had expected this. He kept his posture relaxed, his tone steady. "That's an interesting way to phrase it," he said. "I would say we're protecting families, securing our borders, and standing up for the values that built this country." The host let out a sharp laugh. "Families? Borders? You mean controlling people's lives, banning immigrants, and forcing women to carry pregnancies they don't want?" The audience roared again. The host wasn't asking questions. He was making accusations, trying to put JD Vance on the defensive. JD Vance leaned in slightly, his gaze locked on the host. "Funny," he said. "I didn't realize that supporting strong families and a secure country was considered extreme." The host's smirk widened. He was waiting for this moment. "Let's talk about something even worse." The room tensed. JD knew what was coming next. "Your recent meeting with President Zelensky. You and Trump humiliated him. You sided with Putin. Tell me, Mr. Vice President, how does it feel to betray an ally?" The crowd erupted. People were on their feet, booing and cheering. The trap had been set. And JD Vance was right in the middle of it. JD Vance didn't flinch. He let the noise settle, waiting just long enough for the tension to build. The host sat back, arms crossed, enjoying the reaction from the audience. He thought he had won. Jade's voice was calm but firm. "That's an interesting accusation. But let's be clear about what actually happened in that meeting." The host leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "Oh, please, enlighten us." JD didn't break eye contact. President Zelensky came to the White House expecting another blank check. He thought he could demand billions from American taxpayers without accountability. What he got was a reality check. "Donald Trump and I made it clear America's support is not unconditional. Ukraine has received over $100 billion in aid. And yet, there's no clear plan for victory, no strategy for peace, just more demands. At what point do we ask, what is America getting in return?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some murmured, others booed. The host scoffed. "So you think Ukraine should just surrender?" JD shook his head. "I think the American people deserve answers. Where has the money gone? Why are we funding a war with no defined objective? And why is it considered pro-Russia to ask these questions?" A few people in the audience actually clapped. The host's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting pushback. He quickly recovered. "You're twisting the facts, Mr. Vice President. Trump and his allies have always been soft on Russia. You refuse to call Putin a war criminal. Why?" JD leaned forward slightly. "Because I don't make emotional declarations for the sake of applause. I deal in reality, not sound bites," the audience gasped. The host's smile faltered for just a second. JD continued, his voice steady. "You want to talk about real betrayal? Let's talk about how this administration is focused on foreign wars while American families are struggling at home. Let's talk about how you, and people like you, care more about funding a government halfway across the world than protecting our own borders. Because that's the real scandal here." The host waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, here we go, the border crisis. Another Republican talking point." Jay didn't blink. Not a talking point, a fact. The audience was no longer fully on the host's side. Some had gone quiet. Others whispered among themselves. JD Vance had landed his first real blow. The host narrowed his eyes. All right, let's talk about your so-called family values, because that's another thing conservatives love to preach about while doing the exact opposite. JD knew what was coming next, and he was ready. The host sat forward, his expression smug, sensing an opportunity to regain control. His tone was laced with sarcasm. Oh, I'd love to hear more about these so-called family values you keep talking about. Because let's be honest, Republicans love to preach about protecting families, but what do you actually do? You ban abortion, take away women's rights, and force children into situations they never asked for. How is that family values? The audience exploded in cheers. The host smiled, enjoying the moment. He thought he had JD Vance cornered. JD waited. He let the noise settle, then calmly leaned in. Family values mean standing up for the most vulnerable, he said. They mean protecting children from a culture that's obsessed with confusing them about who they are. They mean creating strong communities where parents, not the government, decide what's best for their kids. They mean recognizing that a strong nation starts with strong families. The host scoffed. Right, so family values means controlling people's personal lives? Telling women what they can do with their bodies? Banning books? Silencing teachers? JD Vance's expression didn't change. His voice remained measured, steady. Family values mean telling the truth. And the truth is that America is in a crisis. Our birth rates are declining. Our young men are lost. Our families are breaking apart. And instead of addressing it, people like you mock the very idea that family should come first. The host's smile faltered for a brief second. JD wasn't rattled. He wasn't defensive. He was completely in control, but the host wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You talk about protecting kids, but let's be real. Conservatives only care about kids until they're born. After that, they don't want to fund education. They don't want to help struggling parents. And they certainly don't want to do anything about gun violence. So tell me, Mr. Vice President, how can you claim to care about children while doing absolutely nothing to keep them safe in their own schools? A murmur rippled through the crowd. The host had turned the conversation onto gun control, another emotional, divisive topic. JD Vance knew this moment would come. He was ready. The host leaned back, arms crossed, watching JD Vance closely. His words had been carefully chosen, designed to stir outrage. The audience was waiting for JD to stumble, to struggle with an answer. But JD didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, firm. You want to talk about protecting children? Then let's actually talk about it. Because the biggest threat to kids in America isn't responsible gun owners. It's the collapse of the family, the rise of fatherlessness, and the unchecked crime in liberal-run cities. The host smirked. Oh, so now single mothers are the problem. JD shook his head. No, the problem is a culture that tells young men they don't need to take responsibility. That tells children their identity is something to be questioned rather than strengthened. That tells criminals they can do whatever they want without consequences. The host interrupted, voice rising. You're dodging the question. We have mass shootings in schools. Kids are dying. And you're telling me that the real problem is what? Woke culture? Jay didn't blink. I'm telling you that the places with the strictest gun laws also have the highest crime rates. Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. You think taking away guns from law-abiding citizens will stop criminals? Or do you just want to disarm the very people who can defend themselves? The audience wasn't cheering as loudly as before. Some of them were listening now. The host knew he was losing them. He needed a new angle. He pulled a stack of papers from his desk, flipping through them dramatically. Fine, he said. Let's move on. You talk a lot about law and order, about protecting American citizens. So explain this. Why is your administration obsessed with stopping immigrants from coming to this country? Why are you blocking desperate families at the border while claiming to stand for family values? The crowd erupted again. The topic had shifted to border security. The trap had been reset. JD adjusted his mic and prepared to shut it down. The crowd was alive again, cheering and clapping at the host's latest attack. He smirked, knowing he had hit on one of the most controversial issues in America. JD Vance let the noise settle before he responded. His voice was calm, steady. You ask why we're stopping illegal immigration. The real question is, why aren't you? Why do liberals care more about non-citizens than they do about struggling Americans? Why are we spending billions housing illegal migrants while our own veterans sleep on the streets? The host raised a hand, cutting him off. Oh, please. That's just Republican fear-mongering. You act like the border is under attack when in reality, immigration makes this country stronger. That's what America is built on. JD Vance nodded. You're right about one thing. Legal immigration built this country. My own grandparents were immigrants. But what's happening at the southern border right now? That's not immigration. That's a full-scale invasion. And it's happening because people like you refuse to enforce the law. The host scoffed. Invasion? Really? These are families, JD, parents and children running from poverty, escaping war. And your administration is treating them like criminals. JD leaned forward, his eyes locked on the host. Let me tell you about one of those so-called families that crossed the border illegally last month. A man came in, no identification, no background check. He was given food, shelter, legal aid, everything the left says is compassion. A few weeks later, he was arrested for brutally assaulting a mother and her child in broad daylight. Tell me, where was your compassion for that family? The audience went silent. The host hesitated, but only for a second. One case? You're using one case to demonize thousands of people? That's called fear-mongering. JD Vance shook his head. No, what's fear-mongering is pretending that open borders don't have consequences. What's fear-mongering is ignoring the fact that fentanyl brought over by these so-called migrants is the leading cause of death for young Americans. What's fear-mongering is watching American families get torn apart by crime and addiction and doing nothing to stop it. The host was getting frustrated now. He wasn't used to guests fighting back this hard. He needed to regain control. All right, he said, flipping through his notes. You love to talk about law and order. Let's talk about January 6th. Let's talk about your president inciting an attack on democracy. You stood by him. You defended him. So tell me, do you still support a man who tried to overthrow the United States government? The audience erupted again. The host had thrown down his biggest attack yet. JD Vance didn't move. He was ready for this. The crowd was on fire again. The host leaned back in his chair, confident that he had finally cornered JD Vance. The question had been designed as a knockout punch, one that no Republican could answer without losing. JD Vance knew exactly how this game worked. He had watched it happen before. A conservative comes onto a liberal talk show, gets bombarded with accusations, and is forced to play defense the entire time. But he wasn't here to play defense. He adjusted his mic slightly and looked the host straight in the eye. His voice was measured, calm, and completely unshaken. You want to talk about January 6th? Fine, let's talk about it. The host folded his arms, waiting for the usual attempt at deflection. But JD wasn't going to deflect. That day was a protest that got out of control. A group of Americans frustrated with a system they felt had failed them went too far. That's the truth. The audience started to boo, but JD wasn't finished. But let's be clear, if we're going to call that an attack on democracy, then we need to call what happened in 2020 an attack on democracy too. Riots burned through American cities. Businesses were destroyed. Innocent people were beaten in the streets. And yet, your side called it mostly peaceful. Where were the endless investigations then? Where were the televised hearings? Where were the arrests of the people who set fire to police stations? The host's smirk faltered for the first time. JD leaned in slightly, his tone sharpening. You don't care about protecting democracy. You care about controlling the narrative. The host let out a forced laugh. So now you're comparing a violent attack on the Capitol to racial justice protests. JD didn't blink. No, I'm comparing your hypocrisy. If political violence is wrong, it's wrong every time. Not just when it's convenient for your side. The audience reaction was mixed. Some booed, but others who had been completely against JD Vance at the beginning were silent now, thinking. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had lost control of the conversation. Time for another pivot. All right, let's try something else, he said, flipping through his notes. You talk about the American people and what they want. But here's the truth. Trump and your administration are losing support. The latest polls show you trailing in key states. People are rejecting your policies. So tell me, Mr. Vice President, if you're so confident in your vision, why is America turning against you? JD let out a small breath. He had been waiting for this question. The host leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for JD Vance to scramble for an answer. He had set the perfect trap using the latest polling numbers to paint the Trump administration as a sinking ship. JD didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. His voice was steady, measured. You're right, some polls show us behind in certain states. But you know what else those same polls showed in 2016? That Trump had no chance of winning. That Hillary Clinton had already secured the presidency. That the American people had made up their minds. The audience murmured. Some of them remembered. The media had been completely wrong. JD continued, his tone sharpening. What you don't understand is that the American people don't answer to the media. They don't answer to political elites. And they certainly don't answer to whatever narrative you're pushing today. The host scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Oh, come on. That's the classic fake news excuse. You're losing because people don't want your policies. They don't want your extreme agenda. They don't want Trumpism. JD leaned forward. You keep saying they, but have you actually talked to them? Have you stepped outside your bubble, away from the cameras, away from the celebrity fundraisers, away from the echo chambers, and actually listened to working Americans? The host rolled his eyes. Oh, here we go. The real American speech. The audience was quieter now. Not completely on JD's side, but not fully against him either. The host knew he was losing control again. Okay, the host said, forcing a laugh. So you're the champion of the working class now? That's funny, considering your administration is handing out tax cuts to the rich while cutting programs for the poor. JD raised an eyebrow. Tax cuts? You mean the same tax cuts that let small business owners keep their doors open? That allowed middle-class families to actually save for their future? Tell me, do you even know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck? Because the people I talk to, real Americans, aren't worried about tax loopholes for billionaires. They're worried about making it to the end of the month. The host sat back, jaw tightening. He was out of talking points. JD saw it. He saw the shift happening in the audience. And he knew exactly how to finish this. But let's cut the act, JD said. This isn't about polls. It's not about statistics. It's about one thing: control. Your side wants control over what people say, what they believe, what their children learn, and how they live their lives. You don't want debate. You don't want discussion. You want obedience. And that's exactly why the American people are waking up. The host had nothing. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The audience was still. The energy in the room had changed. JD Vance had turned the entire debate upside down. The host swallowed hard. He had one last chance. All right, he said. If you're so confident in your vision, let's settle it with one final question. He locked eyes with JD. Will you promise right now that if Trump loses in 2028, you'll accept the results? No excuses, no claims of fraud, no denial. The crowd held its breath. JD Vance smiled slightly. He had been waiting for this moment. The host leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. He had thrown his final card on the table. Will you promise right now that if Trump loses in 2028, you'll accept the results? No excuses, no claims of fraud, no denial? The audience held its breath. This was it. The defining moment. If JD Vance hesitated, if he dodged the question, the headlines would be written before he even left the stage. JD Vance didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, clear, and unshaken. I will promise this: when an election is fair, when it is transparent, when the American people can trust the process, we will always respect the outcome. What I won't do is pretend that voter fraud doesn't exist because it makes you uncomfortable. The host immediately jumped in. Oh, so there it is. The election denial. The same dangerous rhetoric that led to January 6th. JD Vance shook his head. No. What's dangerous is ignoring reality. What's dangerous is treating voter fraud like a conspiracy theory while ignoring clear evidence. What's dangerous is silencing millions of Americans who just want to know that their vote actually counts. The audience was no longer cheering the host on. Some clapped. Some were whispering to each other. JD Vance had shifted the energy in the room. The host tried again. So you're saying you'll only accept the results if Trump wins? JD leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on the host. I'm saying that if you truly believed in democracy, you'd be fighting for election security just as hard as we are. The host had no comeback. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. JD Vance didn't wait for him to recover. He turned to the audience, his voice steady. You see, this isn't about Trump. It's not about me. It's about you, the people watching at home, the families struggling under policies that don't work, the parents fighting for their children's future, the workers being replaced by unchecked immigration, the citizens being told that their values no longer matter. You are being lied to, and they don't want you to wake up. Silence, not a single word from the audience. The host finally spoke, but his voice was weaker now. Well, Mr. Vice President, we're out of time. JD Vance gave him a small, knowing smile. Yes, you are. The credits rolled. The cameras turned off. But the conversation was far from over. Because millions of Americans had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. That was one of the most intense interviews JD Vance has ever faced. But did he win the debate, or did the host manage to trap him? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Did JD Vance expose the truth, or was the host right all along? And if you love stories that reveal what the mainstream media won't tell you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more shocking stories coming your way, ones they don't want you to see. We won't believe what happened before you, though. Check out this next video right here. You won't believe what happened.